Hi, my name is Glenn Hasselman. I'm just making this video for the users of free accounting software to show you guys how to some aspects of single touch payroll. Now, what I want to cover off today is the ID numbers, and there's two ID numbers that are relevant here. One is the business's ID number, and I'll show you where that is. So if we go into the setup my business details page, there is this title pane that is collapsed by default, so just expand that and it gives you it shows you what the ID numbers are. So the first one here is called the Business Management System ID, or often called to the BMS ID. It says bracket for single touch payroll, and we can see that it is a really big, long, horrible string of letters and numbers. That is generated when you first create your business file, and it's generated randomly, and that is the ID number assigned to your payroll system. And the reason your payroll system has an ID number is because the ATO envisages that you might have more than one payroll system. So a company could have different branches, each processing their own payroll, and they would be having separate ID numbers. The other ID number of relevance is the employee's ID number. So if we go to the counterparties and select the employee, then go to the payroll details, and this is on the TFN declaration that this ID is shown. The TFN declaration being a little bit more of a general tax information page now. So there is this field here called the employee's payroll ID, and I've actually put a manually put an ID number in there for this employee. That number also generates as a random big long number, but I've overridden it in this case. Now, the reason these two numbers are important is because the ATO is no longer, or prior to single touch payroll, you would lodge a pay-as-you-go payment summary, and there would be one per employee, and based, I guess it would be, uniquely keyed by your business ABN and the employee's tax file number. That's no longer the case. It is keyed by the Business Management Systems ID and the employee's payroll ID. So when you report to single touch payroll, you report under the employee ID as well as the Business Management Systems ID, and that creates a record in the ATO system. Okay, so if you change either of those ID numbers, you will create a duplicate record at the ATO. So here is a page which kind of shows what that looks like. Now, this is on the employee's MyGov login. This is not something you can log into the business portal and see. Okay, so in this case, there are two records for the same employer, and that might be what you want, because you might have two branches with their own payroll systems, and the same employee might work a little bit at each branch, ends up getting two pay slips, and that's what you want. Or it could be that they worked part of the year at one and part of the year at the other. Now, it's also probably even more likely that this is not what you wanted. Okay, so keeping in mind that with single touch payroll we're reporting year-to-date earnings, then we could see that perhaps this person has earned $15,000, and then maybe in the next pay the ID numbers was changed, and then it was reported again at 20,000, and this 20,000 might include the previous 15,000. So in that case it's double counting that 15,000, and it's not what we want. So when changing either of those ID numbers, well, the best thing probably is that you never change them, but you might want to change them for some reason. You need to make sure you change them properly so that you don't create this duplicated income statement scenario. So in this video I'm going to show you how to change the employee's payroll ID. So we've got here the employee's ID. To change it, we simply make the change over here and click Save. Okay, we want to make a note of what the previous payroll ID was, because we'll need that in a moment. So we now need to advise the ATO of what the previous payroll ID number was, so that the ATO can I guess move that previous income statement into this one, or move the, I don't know how you'd explain that. I guess they just want to make sure it's the one, there's one record rather than two. So we do that by doing a payslip. So we have to do an update event. So let's do a new batch, and just calling it update employee ID. Now you probably just pick the date that the change happened. Okay, I think it's important to make sure it's in the correct financial year, if it's around the June-July cutoff. And I'll save that batch. Then we go to transactions and create a new payslip. Select the employee. Now on this payslip we cannot pay the employee anything. It's just got to be a blank payslip. So I'm actually just going to delete this line, which it puts a blank line there by default, but I'm going to just select the tick box and click delete selected lines to remove it. And this is a $0 payslip. Now we can see the employee's payroll ID coming through here, being what we typed in on the TFN declaration page. There is a spot here for the previous payroll ID. So this is where we type the previous ID, which is nice and easy to remember, and then save. Okay, now you might have other employees, and you can add a $0 payslip for each one of them to change their IDs if you were changing many of them at once. Otherwise you just go to the STP lodge page and you lodge it. So here we tick the box to agree to the declaration. select the Oz key. Now, instead of clicking the Lodge STP batch button, it will be grayed out because they're all $0 pay slips. And we've got this option here to update. So let's click that. Okay, and it goes through the normal Lodge process. Now, I should have pointed something out, so I'll just go back to the transactions and click onto this employee payslip here. Keep in mind that it's not just the ID numbers that are being sent to the ATO with this lodgement. All the information is being sent, including the year-to-date amounts. So just make sure you check that they are in fact correct, because that will update the income statement to be those amounts. Okay, you can go back to the STP Lodge page. Still got 11 seconds to go. Alright, so it's still going through the process, and I guess we'll check back later. Another thing to point out, actually, going back to this payslip, is if I click on payslip PDF, just save that somewhere. On all the payslips, I'm printing now the BMS ID as well as the employee ID. So if I zoom in, it's quite small and it's in light grey print at the bottom of the payslip. It says BMS ID and that horrible long list of numbers, and employee ID and the ID that I assigned to the employee. There's a good reason why I'm printing this on the payslip, and that is because it's not accessible through, I think maybe the BMS ID will be accessible, but if you go into your business portal, you will not be able to see the employee ID. So unless you have a record of it somewhere, then you won't even know what it is unless if you've manually assigned it. You probably have a record of that. The thing is, when you need to know this employee ID, can also be at a point where something's gone wrong, like your computer died and you've lost the file. So this kind of thing. So this, hopefully you'll have a copy of the payslips in your email where you've emailed it to the employee at least, or that kind of thing. So then you can use these same ID numbers to recreate the year-to-date, and that way, because you're using the same ID numbers, then it won't create a duplicate record with the ATO. Okay, so let's probably finish lodging, and there it is, message accepted. Yeah, that's it. That's how you change the employee ID. I hope that what I've done here is explained it well enough that people can follow it. I think it's it would be good to know how these IDs work before you even start, so that you can set up meaningful ID numbers and use them in the beginning. Hopefully people will watch this before they actually do the first payslip, although I kind of think it's difficult to get into an advanced thing when you're trying to just start out, which probably means you're stuck with the really long ID numbers. Okay, I hope the video has been useful to you, and thanks for watching.